The wrestling world loves to argue about who did it first. Fans will debate for hours about legendary gimmicks, iconic factions, and unforgettable characters that shaped the industry. But here's something that might surprise you. Some of the most famous WWE ideas actually showed up somewhere else first. In fact, if you look closely at wrestling history, you'll notice that WCW experimented with many of these concepts long before they became household names in WWE. Some gimmicks became bigger once they arrived in WWE, reaching a much larger audience and becoming attached to an entire generation of fans. But the seeds for those characters were often planted earlier. That's exactly what we're diving into today. If you came here to find out which WCW stars were already doing the gimmicks people later associated with WWE, you're in the right place. Because the deeper you look, the more you realize that the story of wrestling is full of ideas being reinvented, repackaged, and brought back in new ways. So, let's jump right into it. Starting off with number 10, Eric Bischoff. This pick often sparks debate because when fans think about a power-hungry authority figure in wrestling, most immediately picture Mr. McMahon, and that's completely understandable. Vince's on-screen character became a defining part of the Attitude Era, especially during his iconic feud with Stone Cold Steve Austin. His portrayal of a corrupt, controlling boss was so convincing that he became one of the most memorable villains in wrestling history. However, if we focus purely on the timeline, things get a bit more interesting. Before Mr. McMahon fully established that role in WWE, WCW had already introduced Eric Bischoff in a similar position. Under the persona of Eazy-E, Bischoff carried himself with a smug confidence that made him instantly unlikable to fans. He acted like a man who believed he controlled everything around him, and that arrogance made him a perfect villain. Bischoff's character worked especially well because of his connection with the NWO, where he positioned himself at the center of the chaos unfolding in WCW. What made his role even more intriguing was his transformation. He originally appeared as a friendly commentator, but over time, that persona evolved into a manipulative authority figure. That shift helped create a compelling character and showed that WCW had already begun shaping the evil boss archetype before it became a major storytelling staple in WWE. At number 9, we have the New World Order. When discussing rebellious factions in wrestling history, it's impossible to overlook how huge the NWO became. Formed by Hulk Hogan, Kevin Nash, and Scott Hall, the group didn't just become another villainous stable, they completely changed the atmosphere of professional wrestling. The NWO felt dangerous and unpredictable, almost like a hostile takeover happening right in front of the audience. They acted as if the rules of the company no longer applied to them, constantly disrupting shows, mocking authority, and behaving as if they owned the entire industry. Another faction that embraced rebellion and disrespect toward authority was D-Generation X. While DX had its own unique identity, especially with sarcastic humor and outrageous antics, the core idea behind both groups had clear similarities. Both factions thrived on breaking the system and challenging authority figures. The NWO presented themselves as outsiders invading the company, while DX turned rebellion into something more comedic and provocative. However, the NWO's massive success helped push wrestling towards an edgier storytelling, ultimately paving the way for WWE's Attitude Era. Number 8 takes us to Disco Inferno is a great example of how unusual wrestling gimmicks can still become memorable. Sometimes a character may sound strange on paper, but the right personality can make it work. Years later, fans saw a similar idea with Fandango in WWE, especially during the entertaining Fashion Files storyline with Tyler Breeze. While the character was unique, the concept of a dancing wrestler was still quite unusual. Imagine spending years training to become a professional wrestler only to be told your gimmick revolves around ballroom dancing. Before Fandango, WCW had already explored this idea with Disco Inferno. His entire persona was built around disco culture, featuring flashy outfits, energetic dancing, and an entrance that felt more like a dance party than a wrestling introduction. Inspired by the disco era and figures like John Travolta, the character stood out immediately. Interestingly, these dancing characters were not always portrayed as heroes. Their over-the-top attitude often annoyed fans, creating reactions that ranged from laughter to boos, making the gimmick surprisingly effective. Coming in at number 7 is Lex Luger's character in WWF was built around the idea of extreme self-admiration. Known as the narcissist, he constantly praised his own physique, flexed his muscles, and admired himself in mirrors. The gimmick was simple but effective because it highlighted arrogance and vanity, making him an easy villain for fans to react to. The message was clear. Luger believed he was the perfect physical specimen and expected everyone else to see him the same way. Years later, WWE introduced Chris Masters, the Masterpiece, whose character carried a very similar concept. Masters frequently posed to show off his muscular body and displayed the same type of pride in his appearance. While the details of the presentation were slightly different, the core idea felt very familiar. Wrestling often revisits successful character formulas, and the narcissistic, self-obsessed athlete is one that consistently works. Fans enjoy watching overly confident wrestlers because it creates strong reactions and builds anticipation for the moment when someone finally humbles them. At number 6 is The Artist. When fans talk about flamboyant wrestling characters inspired by music icons, Velveteen Dream is often mentioned for his Prince-like style and mystique. However, years earlier, WCW had already explored a similar concept with The Artist, formerly known as Prince Iaukea, later shortened to The Artist. The gimmick featured bold fashion, eccentric behavior, and theatrical charisma meant to make him stand out. While Velveteen Dream later made the idea more impactful, WCW had already experimented with that flamboyant persona. Unfortunately, the character arrived during WCW's decline, so despite the strong concept, it never gained the attention it might have deserved. Number 5 brings us to Goldberg. When Goldberg burst onto the scene in 1997, he felt like a force of nature. His success wasn't based on complex storylines or technical wrestling. The formula was simple but powerful. The music hit, the crowd exploded, and Goldberg stormed to the ring. Moments later, his opponent was crushed by a spear and the jackhammer. This dominant style helped build his legendary undefeated streak and made him feel like an unstoppable superhero in World Championship Wrestling. Years later, WWE introduced Ryback with a similar concept, quick squash matches and overwhelming power. While the comparisons were obvious, the execution was different. Goldberg's rise felt natural and explosive, while Ryback's push often felt inconsistent, which prevented him from reaching the same legendary aura. At number 4, we have the Booty Man. Ed Leslie had one of the strangest wrestling careers, constantly reinventing himself with unusual gimmicks. One of the weirdest was the Booty Man, a character obsessed with his backside, often appearing with Kimberly Page and theatrically slapping it during promos. The gimmick was bizarre but unforgettable. Later in the Attitude Era, WCW introduced Billy Gunn's Mr. Ass persona. Despite the absurd concept, Gunn made it work thanks to his charisma and his role in the New Age Outlaws, turning the gimmick into a surprisingly popular and memorable act. Number 3 is Van Hammer. Music-inspired wrestling characters have appeared many times, but WCW already explored the concept with Van Hammer. He entered the ring carrying a guitar and projecting the attitude of a rock star. The look, the swagger, and the connection to music defined the entire character. Years later, WWE introduced Elias with a similar concept. Elias walked to the ring with a guitar, presenting himself as a wandering musician who used music to mock the crowd before competing. While the presentation was more refined and comedic, the basic concept was very similar. A wrestler whose identity is deeply connected to music and already existed years earlier in WCW. At number 2, Diamond Dallas Page. At first glance, comparing DDP to The Rock might sound strange, because their personalities were completely different. DDP had a gritty, rebellious energy, while The Rock became famous for his unmatched charisma and razor-sharp promos. But the connection here revolves around one specific nickname, the People's Champion. Before The Rock made that phrase iconic, Diamond Dallas Page had already used it in WCW. It represented his connection with the audience and his role as someone fighting on behalf of the fans. Later, The Rock took that nickname and elevated it to legendary status, but the phrase itself had already been used before. And finally, at number 1, the Four Horsemen. One of the most legendary factions in wrestling history, helped inspire a group that fans later loved in WWE, Evolution. The similarities are impossible to ignore. A powerful group of sharply dressed wrestlers who carried themselves like they were above everyone else. Evolution followed the same blueprint that made the Four Horsemen successful. With a veteran leader guiding younger stars, the faction became a launching pad for future legends while dominating the roster. Sometimes wrestling doesn't need to reinvent the wheel. When a formula works, it eventually finds its way back into the spotlight in a new form. And in many cases, WCW had already taken the first step years earlier. Thank you for watching.